Good morning to those of you who join us today from Brazil, and good afternoon to all of you in the UK. It gives me great pleasure to open this webinar today, the first of the Banking and FinTech Committee of the Brazilian Chamber of Commerce in Great Britain. Not so long ago, I wrote to you, members of the Chamber, to inform you of the creation of team-based committees in our Chamber. The main objective of the Chamber when creating these committees was to draw on the large experience of our members and thus bring their expertise and the expertise of their contacts in their areas of work for the benefit of members and friends of the Chamber. Today, this is a reality, and various committees have been formed and are already up and running, namely the Energy and the Decarbonization Committee, the Tax Committee, the Legal Committee, and the Banking and FinTech Committee, which is headed by Simon Davies, one of our speakers today. I would like to encourage you to follow on their work, as they will be delivering a number of interesting and expertise-led events during this year. So as I have just mentioned, today we are launching the first event of our Banking and FinTech Committee. And we do so with a team of utmost importance for foreign companies which do business in Brazil and Brazilian companies doing business abroad. And that is the foreign exchange regulatory framework applying in Brazil. At the end of 2021, a new Brazilian foreign exchange law was published, aiming at bringing more efficiency to the foreign exchange market in Brazil. A long overdue modernization, substituting an old system with a myriad of legislation by modern rules, which are more in line with those applying to foreign exchange markets in the most important economies in the world. Today, we will hear from our speakers what this new law will mean to the Brazilian foreign exchange market and companies operating on it when it comes into force at the end of this year, 2022. So our speakers today are Simon Davies. Simon is a managing director at EBANX, a leading Latin American FinTech. Simon has over 20 years of experience working at board level and growing innovative financial services companies, frequently operating internationally. He divides his time between Latin America and Europe. We also have with us today Pedro Eroles, who holds a PhD degree from the University of São Paulo and is a partner at Mattos Filho Advogados, one of the leading law firms in Brazil, where he advises financial institutions, payment institutions, and fintechs on the most diverse types of transactions. Thank you very much, Simon and Pedro, for being with us today. Just before we start, I would like to say a few words about our housekeeping, and they are the following. I would ask you please to keep your microphone muted and your camera switched off. There will be a question and answer session today, and questions can be asked via our Teams chat box. So please feel free to type in your questions and send them over to our speakers during the whole webinar. Also, I would like to note that this webinar is being recorded and that the recording session will be posted at the Chamber's website and social media platforms in the next few days. So with that said, I would like to start our webinar by asking a first question to you, Pedro. And that is, what is the context and the main changes brought in by the new Brazilian foreign exchange law?
Thank you very much, Vera. Thank you very much, Simon. It's a pleasure to participate in this event of the FinTech Committee of the Chamber. So and thank you for all those who are watching us today, or participating of the audience. So I think it's very important to point out the context of the emergence of this new FX law in Brazil, and to provide this context, it's important to talk a little bit about uh, uh, the FX regulation that is in force today, because the new FX law only enter into force by the end of this year. So our current FX regulation began to be composed in the 20s of the last century. So we have an FX regulation with more than 100 years, with a lot of decrees and laws which uh, 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 pass through uh, different times of the Brazilian history. So the first decree that started the composition of our FX regulation dates of the 20s of the last century, and this FX law, this FX decree, set forth a provision about the prohibition of banks to uh, uh, to do the so-called gaming over the FX in the country. So this provision, which is very difficult to be interpreted and much more difficult to be understood by foreign investors in Brazil. So we have this decree from the 20s of last century. After that, we have some decrees of the 30s from the time of the president, the former president of Brazil, Getúlio Vargas, which set forth, provided for a prohibition of offsetting of cross-border credits in Brazil. So basically, if parties in Brazil and abroad have credit reciprocal credits and debits, they could not offset those credits unless they perform simultaneous FX transactions. This had a tax purpose by the time, but this is currently in force in Brazil, which imposes a lot of hurdles to business models that could be implemented in the country. After that, we had some um decrease from the 60s of the last century during our during the military dictatorship uh, period in Brazil, which set forth some hurdles regarding exports and imports. So we had by that time a stronger intervention of the state in the economy, and this was also reflected in our FX regulation. By that time, we had a prohibition prohibition for financial institutions in Brazil to use resources raised in Brazil abroad. So financial institutions in Brazil could not offer loans or other financial operations to persons abroad. This began to be changed by the 90s in Brazil, when we had a start of the opening of our FX market in the country, and this uh, uh, persisted by until we had the proposition of our FX law in 2019 by the Central Bank of Brazil. So we had the enactment of this law by the end of last year, and this expectation to the entering into force of this law by the end of this year, exactly December 30 of this year. So to point out the main aspects of this new FX law, I think the first that is worth mentioning is some competences to the Central Bank of Brazil. One of these competences is to authorize other entities to operate in the FX market. So basically, today we have our FX sector uh, uh, predominantly uh, 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 um, the main players of our FX market today are banks with an FX portfolio and brokers. So the idea is that the central bank will be able to provide authorizations to other entities, such as payment institutions, for instance, and to foster competition in the FX sector in Brazil. The other competence brought to the central bank was to authorize the opening of bank accounts in foreign currency to residents in Brazil. So this competence has also other aspect, which is the opening of bank accounts in Brazilian reais to non-residents. But the most important to mention is this competence to open bank accounts in foreign currency to Brazilian residents, which is very controversial by the time that the FX law was proposed to the Brazilian Congress in 2019. And other aspect which uh, goes back to the prohibition that I mentioned that in the 60s that was proposed in the 60s of last century that financial institutions could not use resources raised in Brazil to provide loans to residents abroad. This was changed by the new FX law. We have now a provision in the law that allows foreign financial institutions to perform financial transactions with persons abroad to entities with entities abroad using resources raised in the country. So this, of course, will be regulated by the central bank because we have some prudential concerns in this regard. But this was a very important change brought by the new FX law. Other aspect that's worth mentioning is about the legal tender in Brazil. So basically, today, apart from some transactions involving cross-border, some cross-border operations, it's not possible to enter into a contract or into an agreement in Brazil using foreign currency. So all the obligations in Brazil needs to be performed as a rule in Brazilian reais. So the new FX law brings a provision that sets forth a competence to the National Monetary Council to provide for new cases in which contracts can be performed in foreign currency in the country. So this is very important for some sectors in the Brazilian economy that usually needed to enter into a hedge agreement with a financial institution to protect themselves against the FX risk and the variation of the value of the currency. Now we have this provision. Of course, it's yet to be regulated by the Central Bank of Brazil. We'll probably have a public consultation in April that will provide this drafts of the regulation to receive comments from the public. But in fact, this is a very important change brought by the new FX law. Other aspect, very important that I mentioned that in the 30s of the last century had this decrease from the Getúlio Vargas period that provided for a prohibition of offsetting of credits and cross-border credits and debits. It was also addressed by the new FX law with an allowance to perform this offsetting of credits and debits, international credits and debits, in the cases that will be provided by the Central Bank of Brazil. So basically, a lot of hurdles that used to be created by this prohibition of offsetting of credits and debits will fall by the end of this year. And other aspect that's worth mentioning about the new FX law is that the law provides for uh, uh, some cases that uh, uh, persons will be able to perform FX transactions outside or not involving an authorized institution to operate in the FX market. So up to the value of $500 or the same amount, the equivalent in other currencies, it will be allowed to perform FX transactions without the involvement of financial institutions or brokers. This will allow that peer-to-peer companies for foreign exchange transactions to be created in Brazil. And a last change, and without the pretension to the intention of exhausting all the changes brought by the new FX law, is that we used to have a prohibition of subsidiaries in Brazil to remit royalties to their matrices in abroad. So we had also this point addressed by the new FX law, and this prohibition will fall by the end of this year. As I mentioned, and to finish this first intervention, there's a lot of points that still needs to be regulated in details by the Central Bank of Brazil. We are expecting this public consultation by April, so next month, probably the Central Bank of Brazil will issue this public consultation to receive comments from the market about all the details that will regulate the new FX law. So with that, I finish this first intervention, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Most interesting. So I would ask now Simon Davies. Simon, what are your impressions on, and what do you think the main potential impacts of the new foreign exchange law are for cross-border payments?
Hi, Vera. Thank you. I think that the main takeaway is that, well, I'll go into some detail, but what I would like to say is that Brazil is becoming more investor friendly. And let me explain how. And hopefully the technology will work and I'll be able to share a presentation that I've put together on this subject. And can everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay, because I can't. Such as the right. Let's see if I can. I'll just try again. Okay, right. Okay, so a little bit about me, and right. I think that Pedro gave us a very good oversight into some of the complexity with the existing FX raft of legislation that had been in. It was complex, different pieces of legislation spread over 100-odd years, and as a result of which, any FX transactions with Brazil were very slow, very bureaucratic, cumbersome, restrictive, and ultimately, investors or potential investors felt uncomfortable with the complexity and certainly didn't have too much confidence in the system and how it worked. Thankfully, that's now all been addressed as a result of this game-changing legislation, and I think that's where I wanted to emphasize that I think that the best and the most appealing thing about this is that Brazil, which has never been investor unfriendly, but always the complexity has meant that it has been a difficult market. And now we're actually seeing a lot of changes. And essentially, some of the main benefits are in that the Brazilian currency, the real, is becoming convertible or moving towards full convertibility. Certainly, you will see its transferability, its convertibility is improving as a result of these changes, which leads to an awful lot of benefits for external investment, external investors, confidence in the economy, etc. So, as Pedro mentioned, there are some small things that do impact very much on us as payment firms. Transactions can be free. Well, certainly they're much easier, and they're reducing some of the limitations in terms of size. Exchange rates are now, rather than being established, can be negotiated within certain parameters, which makes that whole it becomes a more competitive environment in which to operate. And of course, it's not fully convertible at this moment in time, so there are still controls in place. So you will still see that these FX banks or those institutions that are authorized to carry out FX transactions, they're still involved in the process. And of course, one of the main reasons for that is that there's been a standardization of the prevalent legislation in terms of knowing your customer, money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, all the things that we're involved in every day, which make our lives very exciting. But it's all being standardized within this new legislation. So standardized in terms of the global norms, which I think will make it far easier for external investors and external transferees of money to understand exactly the reasons behind certain questions being asked. As also been touched on, I mean, it does unify all these laws together. It introduces elements of competition. It eliminates an awful lot of the bureaucracy, and ultimately, it is moving towards convertibility. And also, I'll come on to talk about correspondent banking as well, because as the real moves towards convertibility, then the use of the real in international banking through correspondent banking networks, that possibility exists. The ability to open up real accounts in foreign banking institutions, and that treatment of current accounts for residents and non-residents in and out of country as well. So we're seeing this move towards the convertibility, as well as some great benefits in terms of reduced bureaucracy, introduction of competition, etc. Yeah, and if we sort of move on towards, rather than going through every slide line by line, perhaps if I can just pick out a few of the more the beneficial things from the point of view of us as a payments institution, us at EBANX, and indeed all other payment institutions. Cross-border payments at this moment in time mostly exists And I know that there'll be some of you listening in who are, talking about central bank digital currencies and the ability of cryptocurrencies and what they could do. But it exists through correspondent banking. And essentially what happens is that banks, they don't actively send money around the world. They operate through Nostra and Vostra accounts. They have essentially credit accounts with each other. And not every bank has relationships with every other bank. And that's where the correspondents come in. Correspondent banking relationships are where banks have a relationship in which where they have Nostra and Vostra accounts, they're able to carry out transactions. If there isn't a direct relationship with one another, then there'll be a third party or possibly even a fourth party involved, and these are correspondents. So and this complex network exists in order to enable companies such as us and companies such as we represent and individuals such as we are to make transfers of money around the world. And normally when we're talking to Brazil and when we make transfers in and out of Brazil, we use a fully convertible currency such as the US dollar, for example. Now, the benefit of this law is that we are, or the Brazilian legislation that's coming into place is putting in the fundaments of setting up a correspondent banking network whereby foreign banks as well as domestic banks can hold currencies in real in their currency accounts. There is that ability to also open the Nostra and Vostra accounts that are required and reduce the bureaucracy, simplify the AML controls, etc. So all of this is making it far more acceptable. There's a little bit of just about the growth in cross-border payments and the expectations. It's a huge business, the global business, the ability of businesses, individuals, sending money around the world, whether you are working for a company that is seeking to purchase from a Brazilian supplier, or you're an individual who's seeking to send money home to relatives in Brazil. It's a hugely growing market. There are whole economies in the world, Mexico, the Philippines, that actually largely exist on the benefit, well, not largely exists, a large proportion of those economies benefits from remittances, individuals working abroad sending funds home. So this is a huge growth market, huge opportunities. And in this way, with this law, with this timely law, things are becoming much easier for Brazilian real, Brazilian companies, Brazilian individuals to move money around the world. And so that's where we talk about this great ability of the convertibility coming along, whereby the correspondence banking networks should be able to, or should certainly have the opportunity to open up accounts in the Brazilian real, and consequently simplify that whole process by eliminating a lot of correspondence and making the process much easier, much cheaper, and much faster. Of course, this benefits us extremely well in global payments, us at EBANX. I would also point out, though, that there are some benefits to all e-commerce companies. For example, this introduction of a $500 threshold, if you like, where you would have a very simplified form of AML. This enables small value payments, whether they're e-commerce payments or remittances, to be moved very quickly and simply, and consequently facilitate those smaller payments. I talked about the simplification and less bureaucracy. And also by bringing the AML into line with global standards at best practices, it becomes a norm that people understand, and as such also facilitates that entire process. So in a nutshell, it's a great thing for Brazil because it's leading towards international correspondence, it's leading towards convertibility of the real, which should result in external investment into Brazil, the ability for Brazilians also to freely transact money in and out of the country, investors to gain confidence and to to invest with confidence in Brazil and its future. And that's about it from me. And hopefully you can't see the presentation anymore.
Yeah, we cannot. Thanks very much, Simon. That was most interesting.
Thank you.
Pedro, any more remarks? Or okay, so well, thank you very much, you both, for your views on this matter, which is of course very, very important. And Pedro, you did speak about the law being further regulated by the Central Bank of Brazil. So if I may ask, how does the central bank intend to address the matter of bank accounts in foreign currency to Brazilian residents?
Thank you, Vera. That's true. The central bank will regulate all the details of this of the new FX law, and it's important. And even to make a comment before I answer the question, the new FX law proposedly is very, very, very. It's full of principles and guidelines, but lacks details, and this is intentional, because the intention of the central bank when it proposed the law in 2019 was to propose a law which could endure during the time, so it could be adapted with the changes that we will face in the international trade, foreign investment. So basically, we have a lot of detail that still needs to be regulated by the central bank. For instance, the cases in which the legal tender will be accepted, the cases in which the cross-border offsetting will be allowed, so on and so forth. So we have a lot of aspects that still needs to be regulated, and one of them, addressing your question, is about the bank accounts in foreign currency in Brazil. So this is very important to mention, and it's a good question, because when the law was proposed, there was a rumor that this bank accounts in foreign currency would be unrestricted in Brazil. So anyone would be able to open an account in US dollars in Brazil, for instance. But that's not the case. We already have an input from the central bank, and the intention, and this came up because of a rumor that we could have a dollarization of our economy, but the central bank already gave a statement that this will not be the case. The idea is that only some specific sectors of the economy, such as the energy sector, insurers, among others, will be able to open bank accounts in foreign currency in Brazil. The idea is that individuals will not be able to have an account in US dollars in Brazil. So it will remain very restricted to open an account in US dollars in Brazil, even after the law come into force by the end of this year.
Can I compliment that?
Yes, sure, please.
I think Pedro, you make a very it's a good point. And I've seen this concern about dollarization. I know that Brazil has always been passionately against dollarization of the economy. And this legislation, which is obviously intended to assist the convertibility of the real, could be misinterpreted and turned into the opportunity to dollarize the economy. So you've just answered a question for me in that how they would actually protect against that. So I think that that's a really good point. Thank you.
Simon, because this was actually a question that I was going to ask. So you have already covered that point. But Simon, I would like to ask you, I have a question here. How may the foreign exchange law impact the competition in the foreign exchange markets and the fintechs?
I think that what we're going to see is, the answer is yes. What was a highly protected market in terms of a limited number of FX banks and FX suppliers could potentially become a much larger number. And that would lead to increased competition. And if I understand the central bank correctly, I believe that they're in favor of increased competition. They want to see Brazilian companies and Brazilian investors and Brazilian individuals treated fairly and to give them choice. Certainly us as a fintech, we've had a very close relationship with the central bank and often some in-depth discussions with them about things that we are working on and how they feel about it. And generally we get the impression that it is well ordered in terms of what they want, the direction that they're going, which does necessitate more choice, more competition. But at the same time, it's not going to be a free-for-all and they're just going to reduce controls and let the market run riot. So your point is that competition, yes, good thing, in an orderly fashion, ensure that the Brazilian real essentially moves towards their aim, which is a convertible currency, rather than being sidelined in favor of a dollarized economy.
I'd like to make a comment on that. One aspect that was brought by the new FX law and will probably help to foster this competition that Simon mentioned is the proportionality of the regulation. So basically, the idea is that a small broker, FX broker, will not be regulated as an FX bank in Brazil. So inserting this proportionality of the regulation, the central bank also intends to open the market and foster competition in the FX market, which is still concentrated in Brazil.
Thank you both. Pedro, can you see any questions on your chat box? Otherwise, I can go to mine here and read it for you. We cannot hear you now, Pedro. Pedro, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute.
No.
Apologies.
No, okay.
So we have two questions. Yes.
Yes.
So I will read one from Carlos Nebo. In terms of the new law, are there any limitations depending on the transaction type? For example, commercial transactions, sale of goods or provision of services versus capital contribution to a Brazilian subsidiary versus loans to Brazilian subsidiaries versus dividends to be sent outside Brazil. So, Carlos, those aspects will be regulated in details by this regulation that we mentioned, that will be proposed in April by the central bank and probably will publish it in its final version in the second semester of this year. But what we can anticipate is that these limitations and the bureaucracy will be proportional to the type of transaction that you intend to perform. The central bank was very clear in some statements that that it does not intend to impose the same bureaucracy that you have to send money to your son abroad to transaction in comparison with a transaction of $10 million that you are performing to remit funds abroad. So the idea is that proportionality will pass all the regulation and will and will entail this leveling of the obligations and the bureaucracy that you have in each type of transaction. And we have another from Cesar Borali. Cheers, Pedro and Simon, two good friends and former colleagues. Yes, nice to see you here, Cesar. Hope everything is well. What do you think will happen first? Brazilians will be able to open foreign currency denominated accounts, or foreigners, individuals and companies, will be able to open non-resident BRL accounts? I can, well, Simon, I don't know if you want to answer that. So, but please go ahead.
I'll give a quick over. I mean, we as EBANX would probably like the former situation to arise first, whereby Brazilians will be able to open foreign currency denominated accounts. But I suspect, and indeed the greatest benefit for Brazil as a country, is that foreign companies, individuals, will be able to open non-resident BRL accounts, and in that way, inward investment will be encouraged. So I think that's my answer there. We would prefer one, but I think that the emphasis is going to be on two.
That's also my impression, Simon. I think we had in the past in Brazil the so-called CC5 accounts in Brazil, which led a kind of shadow on the possibility of foreign currency denominated accounts to Brazilian residents because of some problems related to these accounts with money laundering and other illicits. So probably that will be the case. If the central bank statements if they will follow these statements that they already gave, we do not have an expectation about this foreign currency denominated accounts to individuals in Brazil. We have other question from Cesar. Does the upcoming elections in Brazil will slow down the FX law implementation? Well, I think I can answer that, but we'll leave to Simon to make his comments and complement if he deems convenient. I don't think so. I think as the law is already approved, I think the activity now will be only from the Central Bank of Brazil. I don't think they will slow down the FX law implementation. This is a priority of the Central Bank's agenda. So I think they will follow the schedule that they already announced to the public. Public consultation in April and the regulation issued in the second semester of this year.
I have nothing to say to disagree with that point of view, Cesar, and indeed your and Pedro, sorry, your point of view to Cesar's question, but you know, and I don't know what the outcome of the elections are looking like either, but promises to be quite controversial, whatever happens.
I think we have another from Anders Norinder. Excellent presentations. Are there any limits to the $500 transactions, such as a monthly cap? Well, this $500 limit is per transaction that is set forth in the regulation, in which the foreign exchange transaction could be performed outside or without involvement of an authorized institution. So it's not a monthly cap, it's a limit per transaction.
And to complement that, and this is an issue that we come across all the time, legislation says one thing, and legislation also says you need to have the right level of anti-money laundering controls in place. Now, one of the most one of the most infamous methods of money laundering is a thing called smurfing, whereby you would make lots of small payments, or whereby a money launderer would make lots of small payments underneath thresholds that are established for remittance purposes, such as this. In companies such as EBANX and every bank that's involved in FX, we all have systems, highly automated and very clever systems called transaction monitoring systems, where we're looking out for certain behaviors involved in money laundering. And one of these would be, Anders, in response to your question, if somebody's making daily transactions of $499 a day, very quickly a transaction monitoring system would flag this up and say, there's something strange going on here, it needs investigating. So although the legislation says one thing, do always bear in mind that the legislation is also very much in favor of standardizing anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing controls, which would obviously get in the way of or may obstruct some of these transactions.
Thank you. Pedro, you have any more questions? Because I have one here that, I would like to ask.
I think not. No, please go ahead, Vera.
Yeah, well, in relation to the real-time payment systems in Brazil, so-called PIX, that is very much used in Brazil now. How will these real-time payment system be impacted by the new foreign exchange law?
Well, the Central Bank of Brazil had already announced the international PIX. So basically what we are seeing now is a kind of conversion of the convergence of some projects that have been led by the central bank, such as open banking, the PIX, the new FX law, in new projects. So one of these projects is the international PIX. So PIX is a huge success in Brazil, but it's used only in domestic transactions. So you cannot use PIX to make a cross-border payment. So the idea that we will have less bureaucratic FX legislation, and we are going towards full convertibility of the real. This will provide the grounds for the international PIX in Brazil.
Thank you. Simon, you have any comments about this?
And that's, I think Anna Carolina's just asked a question, which I think is largely tucked into that. If I might step in, Vera, and just tied into your response, Pedro. And that's, I mean, essentially what is happening in Brazil is it's moving towards convertibility and transferability, full convertibility and full transferability. Mexico may be the country in Latin America that has a fully convertible currency, the Mexican peso. So similar effects on the Brazilian economy that Anna Carolina has asked about. I mean, obviously this change is being undertaken by the Brazilian central bank carefully. They're not just diving into it and releasing all controls. And I think it's very what you will see an outcome similar to, in many respects to, well, hopefully in many respects, you will see an outcome similar to the Mexican peso, a fully convertible currency, and consequently the ability to make payments around the world, and then tying into local distribution systems such as PIX, so that those payments become truly instantaneous, and also from a money payments or payment services providers point of view, rather than pre-funding, because the payments are going through so quickly. Your pre-funding requirements are much reduced, and ultimately a benefit for the free movement of capital around the world.
Thank you. Well, I think that I can't see further questions here in my chat box. So unless you have any, maybe you, Pedro, and Simon would like to say final words, because we are reaching our time here. Thank you. So who goes first?
I'll just
Thank you.
it seems to me it's a great whilst it's taken a long time in order to standardize the legislation and to ensure that all these bureaucratic niceties are removed. I think that this is potentially one of the greatest moves that could occur in Brazil's economic and developmental history, and is a great opportunity for external investors and Brazilian investors looking to externally as well. So Brazil could ultimately become and deliver on its potential to be one of the great economies in the world as a result of changes such as this one. That's certainly what I'm counting on.
Well, to make my
Thank you very much.
final remarks here, I think we have an aspect that is very unique in Brazil, which is an alignment between the Central Bank of Brazil and the private sector. So the regulator in Brazil really intending to foster competition and to open the market in the country. So as we mentioned in the beginning, our FX regulation was one of the hurdles in our economy. So we have a very old, very anachronic FX regulation, which of course poses a lot of hurdles for foreign investment, for international trade, and it is about to fall. So probably it will be a game changer in Brazil. It has been proposed by the central bank with the clear intention to boost the international trade, the foreign investment, to diminish the bureaucracies to perform cross-border payments. So we can expect very important changes in the near future.
Well, thank you very much, both you, Simon, and Pedro, for what has been a very interesting webinar. I myself learned a lot, and I have dealt with foreign investors for the last 30 years, having a lot of hurdles, as you mentioned, to overcome in relation to foreign investors. So it's to foreign exchange matters. So it is good to know that just these changes have been brought in by the law, by the new law that will come into force at the end of the year. And as I said, it's been most informative. It is huge progress in Brazil, good for Brazilians doing business abroad, very good for foreign investors doing business in Brazil. And a number of the points relating to this new law have been clarified today by both of you, for which I am most grateful, and I am sure our audience is most grateful too. So with that, of course, I leave open an invitation to both of you to please come back to us and please speak more on the subject as the matter is going to be developed, and the regulations, as it was mentioned today, will come up. So we would like to hear further from you on this. So with that, once again, many thanks, and I hope to see you all soon. And of course, many thanks to all of those of you who have joined us this afternoon in the UK and this morning in Brazil, and follow the activities of the Chamber. We have a lot more coming up in the next coming weeks and months, with relevant information on business in Brazil and in the UK. Thanks very much, and have a very good day, you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.